Welcome to Sage Garden Ecovillas. It's October 11, 2022, and today this video is going to focus on foresting the walking labyrinth. I'm going to talk about all the steps that we used to start a forest in the walking labyrinth, what worked and what didn't work, based on our experience. Before I get started though, I ought to shout out some of the folks who taught and inspired us, are represented here. Ruth Stout's Gardening Without Work. We drew the idea of hay mulching from that and many other ideas. Masanobu Fukuoka's A Natural Way of Farming, the idea of laying seeds on the ground without drilling them in. And apologies to Fukuoka, our application here is much different, but it started with reading what he practiced. Andrew Mefford's The Organic No-Till Farming Revolution, which contains many examples from many teachers and practitioners who are doing no-till farming. Charles Dowding's No-Dig Organic Home and Garden, which has many both practical and theoretical insights about no-dig gardening. And of course, Maureen Gilmer's Growing Vegetables in Drought, Desert, and Dry Times. The idea I'll talk about later of covering our seeds with our shade cloth was definitely inspired by this book, and many other ideas are in here too. And what's not on the table is Jeff Lawton's documentary video, Establishing a Food Forest the Permaculture Way. That's actually the intent that we started with when we did earlier experiments with these methods, many of which failed, but we learned from them and came to what we've got today, which I'm going to describe. But I also want to warn you, this is not the final step in the evolution of how we will start food forests or start other low water use planting areas. So don't take anything I say here as a recipe. This is just one step in progression where we've had some relative success. So I want to talk about the successes we've had. So let's talk about step by step. When we decided to forest this labyrinth, we already had some existing conditions here from annual plantings that we had done in the past. So the soil was already cultivated. We already had some amendments dug in. I would not, given the choice, repeat many of the things that we did. For instance, we dug in manure at one point. I don't think I would in the future dig into the soil any nutrient-rich amendments. We dug in biochar. I would do that again. I would dig in biochar and any sort of dead organic matter, more so than the nutrient-rich kinds of amendments. We also, to start with, already had an irrigation system set up. You won't be able to see it here, but I'll point it out as I get to a place in my walking where you can see it. There's a drip tube which has, every foot has built-in pressure compensating drip emitters. So that system was already set up. And then from there, what we did in early September is we scattered the seeds we had chosen. I suppose I should back up a step. Before we did that, we designed, what species do we want to include here. By the way, you can see some of that drip tube I was talking about. So it's just a 1/2-inch tube, and every foot there's a 0.6 gallon per hour emitter. So we said, what do we want to happen here? And Charlie actually came up with the idea we ended up with was to have trees between the paths. And so we said, what trees do we have on site that will grow fast, that can be pruned to a very columnar form? By the way, here's some volunteer dichondra growing, which is an excellent plant for this application and for the way that we're using the walking labyrinth. It can tolerate shade, can tolerate foot traffic, and it's also edible. So the answers we came up with were Leucaena and Moringa. We have an abundance of seed on site that we get for free. and they can withstand heavy pruning, so we can prune them into columnar form between the rows. So we scattered the seeds in early September, just broadcasted them right on top of the surface of the ground. Didn't dig them in, didn't drill them in or anything. Then we immediately covered them with a growing medium. I would have preferred to use pure kitchen compost. We didn't have enough volume of compost to cover the whole thing, so we bulked it up with peat moss. So we covered that thinly, I would say, half inch to an inch thick, and then patted it down gently. So it's not packing it down tight, just patted it down to kind of slow the evaporation from the depth where the seeds were. And by the way, you can see here's our Lucana popping up here, and the moringas are really tall. They've been sprinting over the past couple of months. Well, 1 month. And also some cowpea, which I'll get to in a second. That's one of our next steps. So we covered that with the growing medium, covered the seeds. So again, the seeds were laying right on the ground. Growing medium we put on top, so there's no effort to drill the seeds in, or we didn't have to use a seeder or anything like that. And this is the method we used is informed by previous experiments where our objective was a little bit different. We've been experimenting to find low effort, low input, scalable ways to start food forest areas in our dry climate. And so that's where that technique came from, along with all of the other pioneers I talked about earlier. So on that same day, though, of sowing the seeds, we also covered this whole area with shade cloth. We didn't put up a structure of any kind. We just put the shade cloth right down on the ground, on the surface of the ground. And we left it there for about 2 weeks. Now, keep in mind, this was back in September, so it's really hot. We're still consistently getting triple-digit temperatures. And we wanted to slow down the evaporation, wanted to keep it cool under here. We wanted to reduce our water use. So that was a real simple, low effort, low tech way to do that. Then as soon as we removed the shade cloth, about 2 weeks later, we added a thin layer of hay mulch. Sorry, Ruth Stout, we don't have the 8 inches that you use in your gardening for this application. I wanted to, I guess before we put the hay down, we also looked for open patches where the trees weren't coming up very thickly, and scattered more seeds in those areas, along with the cowpeas. Now that the trees were starting to get a good start, they were getting some altitude, I wasn't worried about them being shaded out by the cowpeas. So on that second pass of seeding, it was Lucana in the areas that were thin, cowpeas all around, and then covered that just with hay mulch. We didn't put any more of the growing medium down. Lucana does a pretty good job of germinating under just hay. Cowpeas are champions at it. I mean, they'll germinate in just about any conditions. Moringas, I've tried to do that with moringas, to just cover them with hay, and I personally have not had any success in the past with that. But Lucanas, you know, you don't get a really high germination rate, but it's pretty good. So we spread those seeds and then cover them with hay. One thing I should point out is the watering. Besides just the drip tube, I also check twice a day to see is the surface of the growing medium wet, by looking at the color to see if it's kind of a dark color, also feeling it with my hand. And if so, we sprayed the surface with just a spray nozzle on a garden hose. So we had a 2-pronged irrigation approach to begin with, just to make sure that the seeds stayed wet so that they could germinate. Also, I should point out here, I keep pulling this Bermuda grass. We started with some Bermuda grass in here, and we made a conscious decision that rather than try to eradicate the grass, which would have taken probably 6 months to a year, to dig it out, let the remainder that we missed grow, and then dig that out, and then let the remainder grow again and dig that out. Or it would have taken a year to reduce or to eliminate it by occultation, using tarps or something like that. So instead we said, let's live with it. Let's pull most of it to give the tree seedlings a good head start. And then we'll just accept that the walking labyrinth will have Bermuda grass in it. We're not going to have any intensive, vegetable crops or anything like that in here. So strictly speaking, it's not a problem. So then, I was talking about watering. So we had 2-tier approach. I would feel the surface to see if I should spray it. Also, I would dig in about an inch and see, what's the moisture like under the surface, about an inch. And if it was drying out down at that depth, I would also run the drip tube. Now, about a month later, we're down to the point where we're not spraying the surface anymore. These roots are established, or they're deep enough where we don't need to worry about the surface drying out anymore, not for these plants. So those were our steps. And then as it continues to grow in the future, we will be pruning off branches that grow into the path. So, branches that come out from the divider either way into the paths, we'll prune those off. Literally by hand, as often as we can, without using secateurs or anything like that, just by breaking the branches off. Let me show you about that. So with Leucaena, it's really easy. If the branches are young enough, you can just see if I can do it with one hand. It's kind of hard with one hand. You can just pull them off by hand. So if we catch them in time, we'll certainly do that. And by the way, I'm not going to waste this thing I just plucked. This is great fodder for chickens. So we'll use these Leucaena pickings for the chickens, and we'll use the moringa pickings for ourselves. They make a wonderful curry. So we'll cycle as much as we can there. So what worked well and what didn't work well? The focus on the linear paths with the drip tube was kind of a natural in the context of the walking labyrinth, but that was not an accident. That was derived from our work on food forest areas like this one, where we've concentrated all of the effort and material inputs in rows along these drip tubes. So same kind of principles are at work here. This allows us to reduce the quantity of inputs in terms of water and amendments and seeds, and it also kind of reduces the effort. And it makes really good ideal conditions along a linear path. So fewer inputs, and as far as trees are concerned, they will still fill out this area very well. And then once the trees are more established, it'll be much easier to establish some other support and productive species in the same area. So the linear focus worked well. The idea of sowing and then covering with growing medium, that I'd have to say worked really well, although we did lots of experiments that led up to that where we failed to grow anything, failed to germinate. So just keep that in mind. And we're still going. There's some things about what we're doing now that I would like to change. The idea that we have to use the drip tubes plus spraying irrigation on top, I don't like that. That seems like extra work. And so one of the things I want to try next is to use a soaker hose instead of a drip tube. So that will apply water along the whole length rather than just in discrete points 1 foot apart. So in past, we failed, as I mentioned before, using moringas without a growing medium, just putting the moringa seed on the ground and covering with, for instance, hay. That didn't work very well. We also failed in the past by not using enough water during the germination phase, and that led to many disappointing failures. We also failed because the emitters were not spread out along the whole length. So those last two mistakes, that is why we did the two-step irrigation with the garden hose and with the drip tube. So, and another thing that I would definitely change the next time in the walking labyrinth, I told you we had two kind of passes of planting. Now that we know more, it would be much preferable to just do it all in one pass. So we'll definitely do better in that. But hopefully you found this video interesting, maybe informative. Hope you got some good reference material from it to do your own research. And I hope that you come away with the idea that if creating food forests in the dry, hot Arizona is something you want to do, you can definitely do it. So thank you for watching. Have a great day.